It's 2:30 in the morning. Pitch black. Freezing cold. Somewhere on a tiny, wind-battered island in the South Atlantic, 45 British soldiers are crouched in the dark, weapons ready, explosives in hand, less than 100 meters from 11 Argentine warplanes that could, within days, tear apart the most important British military landing since D-Day. They have exactly 30 minutes. Not a second more. The moment the sun begins to creep over the horizon, the mission fails, and every man on that island is either dead or captured. This is the story of the Pebble Island Raid. A mission so audacious, so perfectly executed, that military historians still talk about it today as one of the greatest special forces operations ever carried out on the face of the earth. Most people, if you showed them a map of the world and asked them to point to the Falkland Islands, would struggle. And if you asked them to find Pebble Island specifically, you might as well be asking them to find a raindrop in the ocean. Pebble Island is, by almost every measure, unremarkable. It sits roughly 40 square miles in total, just 4 miles across at its widest point, tucked to the north of West Falkland in the South Atlantic. In 1982, its entire population numbered around 25 people, most of them sheep farmers, tending to a flock of roughly 25,000 sheep. Life there was quiet, remote, and largely untouched by the wider world. The island had a small airstrip, or more accurately, 4 of them. 3 were grass runways, and 1 was carved right out of a beach. By any military standard, it was amateur infrastructure at best. But location, in warfare, is everything. And the location of Pebble Island was about to make it one of the most strategically critical pieces of land in the entire conflict. Because sitting on that island, just a short flight across open water, was an Argentine airbase that had the potential to turn the entire British campaign into a catastrophe. To understand why, you need to understand the bigger picture. By the spring of 1982, the Falkland Islands had become the epicenter of a war that almost nobody in Britain had seen coming. The islands had been British territory for well over a century, home to nearly 2,000 people of almost entirely British descent. English-speaking farmers and fishermen who had built their lives there and wanted nothing more than to remain under the British flag. For decades, Argentina had contested Britain's claim, insisting the islands, which they called Las Islas Malvinas, rightfully belonged to them. Diplomacy had ground along for years without resolution, both sides locked in a slow-burning dispute that most people assumed would simply continue indefinitely, never boiling over into actual conflict. They were wrong. In the early 1980s, Argentina was not in a good place. The country was being run by a military junta, a brutal, authoritarian government that had come to power through a coup and had spent years suppressing its own people in what became known as the Dirty War. Thousands of Argentine citizens had been tortured, murdered, and disappeared by their own government. The economy was in freefall. Public resentment was growing. General Leopoldo Galtieri, who had taken the top job as head of the junta, was a man under pressure, and he knew it. He needed a win. He needed something that would unite the Argentine people behind him, something that would make them forget, at least for a moment, the suffering he had inflicted on them. He turned his eyes to the Falklands. The plan was simple, in theory. Invade the islands. Plant the Argentine flag. Tell the people of Argentina that their long-stolen territory had finally been reclaimed. Ride the wave of patriotic fervor. The junta calculated that Britain, 8,000 miles away, with a shrinking military budget and a government already exhausted by troubles at home, would negotiate rather than fight. It was, on paper, a low-risk gamble with an enormous political payoff. On April 2, 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. The small British garrison, just 57 Royal Marines, was hopelessly outnumbered and forced to surrender after a fierce but brief fight. Within hours, the Union Jack had been torn down. The Falkland Islands were in Argentine hands. The reaction in Britain was immediate and explosive. In the House of Commons, members of Parliament who hadn't raised their voices in years were on their feet, furious. The British public, which had largely paid the Falklands little attention before, was suddenly gripped by a burning sense of national outrage. And at number 10, Downing Street, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, A woman not known for backing down from a fight made a decision that shocked much of the world. Britain would take the islands back, by force if necessary. Within days, a naval task force was being assembled. Ships that had been sitting in port were hastily repaired and refitted. Troops were mobilized. Merchant vessels were requisitioned and converted into troop carriers. On April 5th, just 3 days after the invasion, the first ships set sail from Portsmouth. A crowd gathered on the harbor to see them off. It was the kind of scene that hadn't been seen in Britain since the Second World War. Warships heading out into an uncertain sea, carrying soldiers who didn't know exactly what they were sailing into. As the British task force steamed south across 8,000 miles of open ocean, the military planners aboard HMS Hermes, the fleet's flagship, a 30-year-old aircraft carrier that had been hauled out of near retirement for the occasion, were working around the clock. The central challenge was obvious. How do you retake a heavily defended group of islands when your enemy has had weeks to dig in, fortify their positions, and prepare for exactly this kind of assault? The answer, eventually, was a large-scale amphibious landing, putting thousands of troops ashore at a beachhead on East Falkland and fighting their way to the capital, Port Stanley. It was a bold plan, and under the right conditions, it could work. But there was one problem. A problem sitting on a small island to the north of West Falkland that threatened to unravel everything. When Argentine forces had seized the Falklands back in April, they had moved quickly to establish a forward air operating base on Pebble Island. The airstrip there, which they renamed Base Area Naval Calderon, had been fitted out to handle a squadron of aircraft. Two types, specifically. The first was the FMAIA-58 Pucara, a twin-turboprop ground attack plane that had been purpose-built for exactly this kind of conflict. It was heavily armed, capable of carrying machine guns, cannons, rockets, bombs, and napalm, and it was designed to operate from rough, short airstrips in precisely the kind of terrain the Falklands offered. The second type was the T-34 Minter, a lighter reconnaissance aircraft that could range across the surrounding sea and report back on British fleet movements with ease. Together, these aircraft represented a nightmare scenario for British planners. Pucara aircraft launching from Pebble Island could be overhead the San Carlos landing zone in minutes. They could strafe landing craft in the water. They could bomb troops on the beach. They could make an already extremely dangerous landing into an outright bloodbath. And the T-34 Mentors, quiet, unassuming little planes that could operate at low altitude and slip beneath radar, could shadow the task force and feed intelligence back to Argentine commanders, potentially giving away the precise timing and location of the British landing before a single British soldier had set foot ashore. The men planning the Falklands campaign weren't given to dramatic language, but the message was clear enough. If those aircraft on Pebble Island were still operational when the landings began, the cost in British lives would be catastrophic. Something had to be done. The question was what? There were two obvious options. The RAF could bomb the airstrip from the air, clean, simple, and relatively low risk for British personnel. Or the Army could send in soldiers to destroy the aircraft on the ground, up close and personal, in the dark. Each option had its advantages and disadvantages. Bombing from altitude was safer for the crews involved, but it was imprecise. A near miss would leave the aircraft operational. A bomb that hit the strip instead of the planes would barely slow the Argentines down. What was needed, what the situation really demanded, was total certainty. Every plane destroyed. No survivors, no cannibalizable spare parts, nothing left that could put even a single Argentine aircraft back in the air. For that, you needed men on the ground. And if you needed men on the ground for a job that was dangerous, precise, and utterly unforgiving, there was really only one unit in the British military capable of doing it. The Special Air Service, the SAS, is, without question, one of the most famous military units in the world. But in 1982, it was a name that still carried a particular mystique, something half rumor and half legend, spoken of in hushed tones in military circles and largely unknown to the wider British public. The regiment had been founded during the Second World War by a young Scottish officer named David Stirling, who had a radical idea. Instead of large formations of conventional troops attacking well-defended targets from the front, why not send in tiny teams of highly trained men to slip behind enemy lines and destroy targets before disappearing back into the dark? The concept was simple. The execution was brutal. The results were extraordinary. In the North African campaign of World War II, small SAS teams had sneaked onto airfields under cover of darkness and destroyed dozens of German and Italian aircraft on the ground. The same kind of operation, in almost every meaningful sense, that was now being planned for Pebble Island 40 years later. The regiment had since been deployed to conflicts across the globe, in jungles, deserts, urban streets, and frozen mountains. Its soldiers were selected through one of the most punishing training courses on Earth, a process so demanding that the majority of candidates who attempt it simply don't make it through. Those who do emerge as something genuinely different. Men capable of operating in extreme conditions, under extreme pressure, with minimal support, making complex decisions in real time that could mean the difference between success and death. In 1982, D Squadron, 22 SAS were embarked aboard HMS Hermes as the task force's primary special forces asset. They had already been in action on South Georgia, where they had taken part in the operation to retake that island from its Argentine garrison. Now, with the main Falklands campaign approaching its critical phase, they were given what would become their most celebrated mission of the entire conflict. Before any raid can happen, someone has to go and look. You can plan from maps and satellite images all you like, but until a human being has crawled within a few hundred meters of the target and seen it with their own eyes, you are planning in the dark, in the most dangerous sense of the phrase. The job of getting eyes on Pebble Island fell to a small team from the SAS boat troop. The boat troop were specialists in maritime infiltration, men trained to move silently through water, to operate in conditions where most soldiers would be unable to function, and to gather intelligence without ever being detected. The original plan was to insert the reconnaissance team by Gemini inflatable boat, small, fast, and difficult to spot on radar. But the engines on the available Geminis were considered too unreliable for the conditions in the South Atlantic, where the sea was rough and the weather unpredictable. Instead, the team was dropped off by helicopter at Purvis Bay and paddled the rest of the way to the island in Klepper canoes, folding kayaks that could be carried on a helicopter and deployed silently in the water. It was slow, cold, exhausting work, and the sea conditions made it genuinely dangerous. But it worked. The reconnaissance team lay up in a concealed position they called Deep Fern Valley during the daylight hours of May 12th, hidden in the vegetation, unable to move, watching and waiting. A day behind schedule due to the rough conditions, they nonetheless pushed on through the following night, repositioning to an observation point from which they could see the eastern end of Pebble Island and, critically, the airstrip itself. What they saw made the information they sent back to HMS Hermes worth every second of discomfort. Crawling forward to get a closer look, the reconnaissance team counted the aircraft on the ground. There were 11 of them, 6 Pucara ground attack aircraft, 4 T-34 Mentors, and 1 short Skyvan, a boxy, twin-engine transport plane. 11 aircraft, sitting on the ground, apparently unaware that a pair of British eyes was watching them from the darkness. The intelligence was radioed back to Hermes. The planners had what they needed. The raid was on. The original concept for the Pebble Island operation had been ambitious, to put it mildly. The initial plan called for a large SAS force to fly in, destroy not just the aircraft but the radar installation, the fuel and ammunition dumps, and deal with the Argentine garrison as a secondary objective before being extracted before first light. It was the kind of comprehensive, decisive blow that would have eliminated Pebble Island as a threat entirely and sent a powerful message to the Argentine command about what they were dealing with. But the reconnaissance had revealed something that forced a rethink. The strong winds that the boat troop had encountered weren't a temporary weather anomaly. They were a feature of the South Atlantic at this time of year. Those winds meant the Sea King helicopters carrying the raiding party would burn more fuel on the inbound flight, reducing their range and, more critically, their available loiter time. Instead of 90 minutes on the ground, the raiding force would have 30. Half an hour. 30 minutes to fly in, destroy 11 aircraft, deal with any Argentine response, regroup, and get back to the helicopters before daylight, and before the Argentines could mount a serious counterattack. The mission parameters were stripped back accordingly. Destroying the aircraft became the absolute primary objective. Everything else was secondary. The raiding force would be 45 men from D Squadron, supported by personnel from 148 Commando Forward Observation Battery, specialist artillery observers who could call and fire from the warships waiting offshore. Mountain Troop would lead the assault on the aircraft themselves. The remaining personnel would provide a protection force, securing the approaches to the airstrip and standing ready to deal with any Argentine soldiers who tried to interfere. Naval gunfire support would come from HMS Glamorgan, a County-class destroyer equipped with 4.5-inch guns capable of striking targets with considerable precision. The Type 22 frigate HMS Broadsword would provide defensive escort for Hermes. Every detail was planned. Every contingency was considered. And then the men picked up their weapons and their explosives and got onto the helicopters. On the night of May 14, 1982, two Westland Sea King HC-4 helicopters lifted off from HMS Hermes and turned towards Pebble Island. Inside them, 45 SAS soldiers sat in the dark, loaded down with weapons and explosives. Each man was carrying at least two 81mm mortar bombs in addition to his own kit. The raiding party had brought more than 100 mortar rounds between them, as well as explosive charges, 66mm light anti-tank rockets, and M16 rifles fitted with M203 grenade launchers. They were not traveling light. They were going in ready for a fight. The helicopters set down approximately 6 kilometers from the airstrip, far enough to avoid alerting the Argentine garrison, close enough that the march to the objective wouldn't eat too deeply into their precious 30 minutes on the ground. The moment the men were off the helicopters, the clock was running. They moved quickly and quietly across the dark, windswept terrain, guided by the boat troop soldier who had conducted the original reconnaissance and who now led them along routes he had already proved safe. The cutting wind and bitter cold that characterized the South Atlantic night worked, in this case, in the SAS' favor. It was the kind of weather that sent men indoors, that dulled sentries' awareness, and encouraged them to stay in the warmth rather than standing in the open. The Argentine defenders, for all the danger they represented in the air, were at this moment doing exactly what cold, bored soldiers do at 3 in the morning. They were not expecting company. As the assault teams approached the airstrip, they spotted an Argentine sentry. He was close enough that a moment's bad luck, a cough, a stumble, the beam of a torch swinging in the wrong direction, could have compromised everything. But the sentry didn't see them. The SAS moved past him like shadows, and the assault teams reached the aircraft. Working in pairs, they moved from plane to plane with practiced efficiency. One man would give the other a leg up onto the wing. The second man would then pull the first up after him. The mentors were small enough that a single leap could get a man up onto the fuselage. The Skyvan, being larger, required a different approach but presented no real obstacle. Explosive charges were placed in the same location on each aircraft, a deliberate choice, made so that the Argentines couldn't later strip parts from one damaged aircraft to repair another. Fuel tanks were punctured, cables were ripped out, and then, once the charges were set and the assault teams were clear, the whole thing went up. At the same moment, HMS Glamorgan opened fire from offshore. The 4.5-inch shells from the destroyer began landing on the Argentine ammunition and fuel storage areas, shaking the ground and lighting up the sky with secondary explosions. The SAS mortar teams added their own fire, keeping Argentine defenders pinned down and unable to mount any coherent response. The assault teams, meanwhile, worked their way along the line of aircraft with M16S and M203 grenade launchers, raking each plane with fire just to be certain, hitting landing gear, engines, anything that might allow an aircraft to somehow survive the charges already placed on it. Some of the SAS soldiers used their 66mm rockets on the larger targets. The noise was extraordinary. Explosions, gunfire, the crump of mortar rounds, the roar of burning fuel. Pebble Island, which on any other night was one of the quietest places on Earth, sounded like the end of the world. The Argentine garrison, to their credit, eventually attempted to respond. But by the time the defenders had gathered themselves sufficiently to engage, the SAS were already withdrawing. One British soldier was hit, caught by shrapnel from an Argentine improvised explosive device that had been buried under the airstrip as a denial measure, triggered when the Argentines realized the operation was more than a simple air attack. A second man was concussed by the blast. Neither wound was life-threatening. The injured soldier was hauled back to the helicopter landing site by his comrades, which was exactly the kind of thing the SAS trained for and expected of each other. You do not leave your own behind, regardless of the cost. The Argentine commanding officer was reported killed in the exchange of fire. His force, leaderless and still reeling from the bombardment, was unable to mount any effective pursuit. The SAS reached the helicopters exactly on time. Every man accounted for. The Sea Kings lifted off into the dark and turned back towards HMS Hermes. Behind them, Pebble Island was burning. When the sun came up over Pebble Island on the morning of May 15th, a Sea Harrier reconnaissance jet was dispatched to survey the damage. The photographs it brought back told the whole story. 6 Pucara ground attack aircraft, destroyed. 4 T-34 Sea Minter reconnaissance planes, destroyed. 1 short Skyvan transport, destroyed. 11 aircraft had been on that airstrip the night before. All 11 were gone. In less than 30 minutes, by 45 men who came in from the sea, did what they came to do, and disappeared before the dawn. The Argentine fuel and ammunition dump had been obliterated by Glamorgan's gunfire. The garrison had been rendered combat ineffective. Pebble Island, as a threat to the British landing, had ceased to exist. Back aboard Hermes, the men of D Squadron were greeted with what one participant later described as a well-earned full English breakfast. The debrief with Captain John Hamilton, one of the officers who had led the assault, confirmed that the Argentines had not managed to establish a radar facility on the island, meaning the garrison's intelligence-gathering capability was also eliminated. The British had achieved everything they set out to do, and more, at the cost of 2 minor casualties. It was, by the standards of any military operation, a remarkable result. 6 days after the raid, on May 21st, the main British amphibious landing at San Carlos Water went ahead. The Argentine Air Force, despite launching some of the most aggressive and costly air attacks on a naval task force seen since the Second World War, was unable to use Pebble Island as a staging point. The Pucaras that might have slaughtered men on the beaches were gone. The mentors that might have tracked the task force's movements were ash. The San Carlos landing was contested, fiercely, and at great cost to the Royal Navy, but it succeeded. 4,000 British soldiers poured ashore. The march to Port Stanley had begun. The Pebble Island Raid has been called, by those who study these things, one of the most perfectly executed special forces operations in modern military history. It achieved its objectives completely, within its time constraints, with minimal casualties, and with consequences that directly shaped the outcome of the entire Falklands campaign. Military historians have compared it to the SAS operations in North Africa during the Second World War. The same regiment, the same concept, for decades later, carrying it off with the same lethal precision that David Stirling had envisioned when he first wrote down his ideas on a piece of paper in a Cairo hospital in 1941. But history has a way of reminding us that even the greatest victories carry a human cost. Captain John Hamilton, one of the officers whose leadership had been so central to the success of the Pebble Island operation, was killed less than 4 weeks later, on June 10, 1982. He was controlling naval gunfire from an observation position overlooking an Argentine garrison of some 800 men near Port Howard when his position was compromised. Wounded and surrounded, he ordered his signaller to withdraw while he provided covering fire alone. He was killed in that action. He was awarded the Military Cross, posthumously, for his conduct at Pebble Island, and it is worth remembering, when we tell the story of a mission that succeeded brilliantly and at small cost, that the men who made it happen were not invincible. They were human beings, doing extraordinarily dangerous work, and not all of them came home. The Falklands War ended on June 14th, 1982, 74 days after it began, when Argentine forces surrendered at Port Stanley. 255 British servicemen were killed. 649 Argentines died. 3 Falkland Islands civilians lost their lives. General Galtieri resigned within days of the defeat, his regime collapsing under the weight of its own catastrophic miscalculation. Margaret Thatcher, whose political fortunes had been transformed by the conflict, went on to win a landslide election the following year. The Falkland Islands remain British territory to this day. And on Pebble Island, a few kilometers from the airstrip where 11 Argentine aircraft once sat in the dark, the sheep are still there. 25,000 of them, more or less, tended by a handful of farmers who simply want to be left alone to get on with their lives. The wind still comes off the South Atlantic every night, cold and constant, sweeping across 40 square miles of grass and stone and memory. Most nights, it is perfectly quiet. But if you stand there in the dark on the right night, and you know the story, you can almost hear it.